like the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. That really gave birth to the modern amusement park industry that grew up in the late 19th and early 20th century. That used the Midway Plaisance that apparently reportedly was the most profitable part of the fair. I think the fair would have lost money were it not for the revenues generated by that.
This episode is brought to you by NewView.
NewView is a team of attractions experts providing an all-in-one reporting suite for attractions businesses.
Their reporting solution empowers attraction leaders to make well-informed decisions based on real-time data.
NewView also builds slick websites that elevates your digital guest experience and provides strategic support to help you with booking systems and all of your IT needs.
For more information, go to newview.com. That's NEW-VUE.com.
Welcome to the Attraction Pros podcast, where we discuss the latest trends and challenges facing the attractions industry today.
We chat with some of the top leaders in the field and provide resources that will help develop your career in this great industry.
I am Josh Liebman. I am obsessed with the guest experience and helping attractions make that their top priority for success.
And I'm Matt Heller. I am passionate about organizational effectiveness, leadership development, and employee engagement.
Now sit upright, hold on tight, and get ready for the Attraction Pros podcast. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
Today, Josh, it's going fantastically.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just so glad to hear that. Question for you.
You got it.
What is the most significant piece of amusement park memorabilia that you own?
I am glad you asked, because if people are on YouTube...
Is that a squirrel?
Oh, close.
Is it a woodchuck?
Close.
Is it a beaver?
It's a mole.
Oh, it's a mole.
From Whack-A-Mole.
So you took the whacked mole.
When I was working at Canopy Lake Park, a good friend of mine was the games manager, and we always used to joke that people were coming for the rides, not for the games. And she would say, but the games make money, the rides don't. And so one of my kind of going away gifts was the mole from Whack-A-Mole. I have the hammer somewhere too, but I don't know where that is.
Very nice. Very nice.
How about you?
Well, about 20 years ago, and this has previously been in my Zoom background before and will make its return one day, I bought on eBay. I think I probably spent more money than I should have on it, but because I still have it and it's framed, it is a 1973 souvenir map of Cedar Point. And what's cool about it is that it doesn't have the year on it. And I have been very interested in Cedar Point history my whole life. Maybe not my whole life, but probably since maybe middle school, high school or so.
Okay.
And I remember looking at the map to try to figure out what year it was, and I narrowed it down to 1972 to 1974, and then posted a picture of it online, and someone was able to say, nope, that thing right there was only there in 1973. So I was able to get the specific year, even though it doesn't have it on it.
That's so cool. That's so cool. Love that kind of research. So why are you asking about historical products and things from the industry?
Because, Matt, today we are getting into the DeLorean and getting up to 88 miles an hour, and we're going back to the past with
Yes.
Futrell. He is a historian specifically for the amusement park industry. So he's worked with the National Amusement Park Historical Association as well as IAAPA, and we get to hear, I think we get to hear two really cool things in this interview. One, we learn a lot about amusement park history, and two, we learn a lot about what it's like to be an amusement park historian. And we get to learn about Jim's process specifically and how he's able to collect all this information and even some myths that he's busted over time.
Absolutely. And we get to hear kind of how he puts context on the history that we may or may not know, again, going back to those myths, and really understanding how the amusement park industry weaves into the fabric of the history of not only the United States, but really the world.
Yeah, exactly. And he also talks about shared experiences across generations, which I think is just really fascinating. The way that he talks about preserving that nostalgia for people as they have children and then grandchildren, and being able to have similar types of experiences as the industry continues to grow into the future as well.
And he also shares some really great resources if you want to get more in tune with the amusement park world and history. Lots of great resources, so be sure to tune in for that.
So should we find the phone booth and then getting to the hot tub time machine for this interview with Jim Futrell?
Let's fire up the flux capacitor, and here we go.
Bringing it a full circle.
Hey, Jim, welcome to the Attraction Pros podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. There's nothing better I can think of talking about than amusement parks on a cold winter day.
Absolutely. We agree, and we cannot wait to get into this conversation. So first of all, can you give us a little bit of background and tell us about your history in the industry?
Sure. I think, I'm a little unusual in that, even though I've been involved in some way with the industry for around 40 years, I've never had a full-time job in the industry. I recently retired from a 38-year career in market research, primarily in economic development. And so, for me, what started as a hobby and evolved into a passion and an avocation kind of became a side gig. And, it started, I think it was something I was born with. I mean, some of my earliest memories are going to amusement parks. I spent my younger childhood in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I would go to Uncle Cliff's Family Land, now Cliff's Amusement Park. It was primarily just a little kiddie park at the time, but I absolutely loved it. And then my mom grew up in Cincinnati. So when we would visit my grandparents, occasionally we would go to Coney Island. And I remember just being absolutely fascinated. I mean, I went there as 4 or 5 years old, and then there's still some very vivid memories of going there, what the park looked like at night, the shooting star roller coaster, the art marquee that had, the noise it made. And I'll never forget when we visited my grandparents in 1972, excitedly asking my dad, we were standing on my grandparents' front porch. That's how vivid this memory is. Are we going to Coney Island? And he goes, Coney Island closed. And he's like, I was devastated. And he was very quick to assure me, don't worry, they moved to a new place. We're going there. And that was Kings Island. And, that really, I think, was one of the things that, the whole story about Coney Island moving to Kings Island and my family history there, really think, started this fascination in the history of the industry. And then there was another watershed moment. It was June 14th, 1976. It was the last day of school. I was in my backyard and our neighbor comes over, and she worked in public relations and had just attended the groundbreaking for Marriott's Great America. By this time we'd moved to Chicago, and she brought us the leftover swag, including the original press kit from Great America, which I still have. I was absolutely fascinated with it. I studied it for hours. And that led to me going to the library and checking out there are only 2 books on amusement parks, again and again and again. And then Gary Kyriazzi's watershed work, The Great American Amusement Parks, was released, and I remember begging my parents to let me buy that book. And then I started, you started hearing about the clubs that were around. I joined American Coaster Enthusiast, and then the Amusement Park Journal came out, and through that I found out about NAFA, National Amusement Park Historical Association. And I think even from very on, it was very clear that I was not necessarily a roller coaster enthusiast. I was an amusement park enthusiast. I loved the whole park, the whole setting. And so I naturally gravitated towards NAFA. And I think, really, they saw me as this young, very passionate person. I started writing articles for their magazine. So in 1984, they named me their historian. And, because of that, I started, doing a lot more research and writing on the history of the industry. And, started to get to know people in the industry. By the mid 90s, I'd gotten to know Tim O'Brien at Amusement Business Magazine. He got me involved in doing articles for them on a freelance basis. That caught the attention of IAAPA. So in 1999, I wrote my first article for Fun World magazine, and something I continue to do. That got me involved a lot more in IAAPA. And in 2005, they launched their oral history program. They invited me to do that. And we've done that, for almost 20 years now. Then that helped grow the relationship. So when they turned 100, they asked me to write the centennial history for IAAPA. And that led to a more formal relationship as IAAPA's historian, starting in 2023. And during that time, I was then in 2000, I was approached to write a book for Stackpole Publishing on amusement parks of Pennsylvania that kind of went with the series of books they were doing at the time, Breweries of Pennsylvania, Diners of Pennsylvania. And that led to a series that went for a few years, and that got me interested in doing books. So, started doing some work for Arcadia, and then Tim O'Brien recommended me to to lead the effort to do this book on Holiday World for their 75th anniversary. So, now that I'm retired, it's become a much bigger part of my life. Still not a full-time job, which is fine, but it's been a great ride, and really look forward to continuing that for many years.
Jim, I'm curious if we could maybe expand a little on maybe the bridge between amusement park enthusiast to amusement park historian. And you shared a little bit of going to the library and checking out that book and then being asked to be the historian. I'm curious if you can kind of talk about maybe that crossover, maybe the evolution of this avocation, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been fascinated with history. Before amusement parks really became my passion, I was really did a lot, was really interested in World War II and the Civil War. I became, a big baseball enthusiast for a while around, the mid 70s when the National League celebrated its 100th anniversary. So, and really did a lot of reading of books about, the early years of baseball and, how baseball was started and how the major leagues grew. And so I think there was always that fascination with history. And I think a lot of, for amusement parks, I was very interested in amusement parks, but there was so little about where they came from. And at that time, Gary Curiosi's book was really the first illustrated history of the industry. There was a couple books that came out beforehand, like William Mangel's book in the 50s that was sponsored by IAAPA. But it was really Gary Curiosi's book, with so many images in it. The imagery was so rich that you really started seeing how that industry evolved. And I think that really sucked me into really trying to find out more. How did Coney Island come to be? Why did Coney Island have this big fall? The parks that existed outside of Coney Island. Growing up in Chicago, when Great America opened, there was a lot of nostalgia for Riverview, which was the great park there that closed in the late 60s, like so many big parks did. And, that was, they advertised themselves as the world's largest amusement park, and quite justifiably. And they were so well known. Their reputation in the industry was such that Bill Schmidt, the owner, was one of the people that Walt Disney consulted with in terms of like ride safety. So, so I was really fascinated by Riverview and how this big park no longer existed. I remember talking my parents into taking me to where the park used to be. Once I got my driver's license, driving over there and hiking through the woods and finding the remnants of the midways that were still there. And so, it was one of these things that kind of grew. And then, you start discovering, you start discovering things like postcards, and, there's such a rich, collection of imagery and postcards for, not in, for everything, including amusement parks. And So you wonder, you look at some of these images and you just wonder what the story is behind those. And as your interest grows, then you start looking at amusement parks being this very old industry. If you look at it, I mean, going back to the European pleasure gardens 500 years ago, and how remarkably resilient this industry has been. It takes these hits, it changes and evolves to reflect the times. And because I think there's this fundamental human need to come together and have fun and escape the pressures of everyday life.
So Jim, one of the things I'm curious about, well, there's a lot of history questions I'm curious about, but before we get to all those, I'm curious, what does a theme park and amusement park historian do? You mentioned writing articles and things like that, but I'm curious, like, what is it that captures your day?
Well, I think, my two historian roles, there are a number of different things you could say we do. I mean, in several forms it can take, so a lot of it, at its base is researching the history of the industry. And, for me, it's, thanks to the digital world we live, it's a lot easier to do. I mean, I'm no longer having to go, travel a couple hours to a library and go through old files and, have the local history librarian say, we might have something on that. You might want to go through this pile of documents or these microfilms. So, I mean, it's researching the industry, confirming historical facts. I mean, I look, one of the things I had a lot of fun with when I was doing the IAAPA Centennial history was myth busting. And I've done that, there's a lot of things as time goes by that becomes part of popular mythology that once you go back to the original source documents was not necessarily the case. And becoming a thought leader and subject matter expert. So being able to speak to the history of the industry for media inquiries, cataloging and preserving industry memorabilia so that those memories are not lost forever. That there is a place to go because amusement park history is a relatively recent genre, like very American history or various wars or something. There's never been a lot of serious effort until I think recent years. But I think being a true historian is really going beyond memorizing facts and figures and then regurgitating them. It is taking those facts and statistics and contextualizing them into that broader historic framework. Why was there this broad shift in the industry after World War II from the family-owned urban amusement parks to the corporate theme parks? What drove the development of the industry after the World Wars? What was the impact of the World Wars on the industry? Because when you look at it in those contexts, it's really interesting what a profound impact a seemingly disjointed event had on the amusement park industry. So trying to do that to develop a better understanding of what is driving change and evolution so that people in the future can learn from that.
So I just got to ask, what myths have you busted?
Well, I think one of the ones one was for years IAAPA thought that their first foreign member was Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Leonard Thompson joined the association in 1938. When I was going through the convention proceedings while researching the centennial, I found at the 1970 or the 1923 convention, Blackpool Pleasure Beach founder William Bean, who was Leonard Thompson's father-in-law, actually spoke at that convention talking about amusement parks in Great Britain. And so that was 15 years before they knew that Blackpool Pleasure Beach was involved. And, and so, I was able to copy scan these proceedings and send them to Blackpool Pleasure Beach. And they were absolutely thrilled to find out they had actually, they still were the first foreign member of IAAPA, but their membership goes almost back to the beginning of the association. So that was one. I mean, the other one was Disney's involvement with IAAPA was actually went back much further than people initially believed. back in the 50s, Admiral Joe Fowler became, who built Disneyland, became involved with the association. And, researching a lot of that, you found out, being able to interview people through the Oral History Project, that, Walt had this vision, groundbreaking, game-changing vision. And he left it to people, his people, to figure out how to make it a reality. So a lot of, they would a lot of times gravitate towards, the people in IAAPA to say, here's what Walt wants to do. How do we do, how do we make it work? So, those were, I think, the two that really surprised me in recent years.
That's awesome. I'd love to hear more of those sometime. But I also want to hear a little bit more about maybe how the amusement park industry and history, I guess, aligns with American history, right? Especially in the United States. Like, how do those two histories kind of intertwine, if you will?
Well, it even goes back further than that. When you look at the development of the cities in Europe, and and during the Renaissance, and they were areas where people flocked to, and they were not very pleasant places. They were crowded, they were dirty, they were disease-ridden, and so people were looking for somewhere to just kind of get away. And so that's when you started seeing the pleasure gardens. So it was a reflection of that. You look at then in the United States after the Civil War, you had the Industrial Revolution. Again, the growth of the urban areas, the growth of a lot of industry, the industrial era, the growth of the industrial era. And then you saw, the transportation companies formed to serve these populations. You hear a lot about the trolley park, but it wasn't just them. It was railroads and steamship companies. They were all looking at ways to generate traffic on non-peak times. So the development of resorts became a natural sideline for them. And I think, what really was interesting then, so for many years, the industry was, especially outside the shores where, entrepreneurs could really build up amusement resorts to take advantage of the traffic going to the shore. The transportation companies really drove the industry. In fact, one of the things I was, again, I was researching, there were efforts to start an amusement park industry trade association going back more than a decade before IAAPA was founded in 1918. But at that time, the transportation industry was so dominant that they never really looked at it as its own industry. It was just a sideline for them. And it took the transportation companies starting to move away from running those and spinning them off to entrepreneurs who saw those as viable businesses to bring the industry together. So again, I talked about how the world wars impacted it. Coming out of World War I, you really started seeing that. IAAPA was founded because the park operators were concerned about the punitive impact of taxes that they were considering levying to pay for World War I. But it also then started this technological and cultural revolution in the 20s that gave rise, really brought professional sports into the forefront, the movie industry, and amusement parks. They had been around. You'd seen a lot of development in the early 20th century, but it was much more passive recreation. There were some rides that tended to be more mild-mannered, but picnicking, dancing, tended to be live entertainment, summer theater. Those tended to be the primary draws back then. It was World War I and the technological innovation, and again, the exposure that people had to the much broader world because of the war, that brought in a much greater emphasis on rides, and then the technology developed along with that. Same thing, after World War II, you had the post-war baby boom, you had the growth of the suburbs, you had the development of interstate highways, which then led to a shift of the industry away from the urban cores to the suburban areas with, kiddie lands and theme parks and themed attractions. So again, you see that. And then even, like today, like so many other industries, it's being impacted by the rise of private equity and the investment banker, and that's changed a lot of the focus of how amusement park companies operate.
It's so fascinating to get. I feel like we just had like a fast forward like timeline from Civil War through through today or even prior to that in the European cities, and it's almost like it's so much to wrap our heads around to be able to say there's so much more significance than I would say even meets the eye initially as far as how amusement parks in general or leisure venues just fit into the broader picture of of everything. You talked about transportation, and you said it wasn't just the trolley parks but the steamships. And I started my career at Cedar Point in Ohio, and that was how they got initially many of their tourists coming in. I believe from Detroit, which is where I grew up in suburban Detroit, and I would visit by car, not by steamship frequently. But I remember once in high school, I think I was a sophomore in high school, I was in biology class, and I was probably wearing a Cedar Point t-shirt, and I had a substitute teacher that day who noticed it, and he had a fascination about history, and he said, I study American history, and in particular amusement park history. And I don't know what the assignment was for the day for the rest of the class, but I sat right next to the desk, and he and I talked about Cedar Point and amusement park history for the full hour plus that many of the other students caught on, as far as like, oh wow, they're just really talking about not just roller coasters but genuinely about history. And it was I just remember the fascination of being able to have this conversation about a significant historical, impact or series of impacts that led to what now we simply enjoy as recreation and leisure. Yeah. So, what about specific moments in history that you love to share that are very unique? I think we know probably a lot of the kind of the easy ones, the most obvious ones, but ones that are maybe not necessarily the most obvious or the most front of mind that are worth sharing.
Well, we talked about kind of the impact of the world wars and the Industrial Revolution. But I mean, some of the other ones, like the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, that really gave birth to the modern amusement park industry that grew up in the late 19th and early 20th century. That used the Midway Plaisance that apparently reportedly was the most profitable part of the fair. I think the fair would have lost money were it not for the revenues generated by that. People wanted to go see the shows and ride the Ferris wheel. So it was really a game changer. And I think the other part of that is a little underappreciated, is if you look at the backgrounds of a lot of IAAPA Hall of Fame members who got their start in the industry at that time, their inspiration was the 1893 World's Fair. So, George Tillieu, who was, built Steeplechase Park, he went to the fair and went back to Coney Island with those ideas of the grounds and the buildings and the Midway. Thompson and Dundee, who built Luna Park, they were there. Paul Boynton, who was a 19th century daredevil. The year after the fair closed, he opened Paul Boynton's water chutes in Chicago at a nearby parcel. And, NAFA in their research determined as best we could that was really the first amusement park to use rides as its primary draw. They didn't have a lake. They didn't have a bathing beach. It was a fenced-in lot with a water chute and a merry-go-round. And people came to ride the water chute and the merry-go-round. Then after his success there, he went to Coney Island and built Sea Lion Park, which then morphed into Luna Park. So, Walt Disney's father moved to Chicago to work on the World's Fair. So, he was inspired. So many people were inspired by that particular fair to take those ideas around the country and around the world to develop their own facilities. So I think that was one of the first great watershed moments. Another one I like to mention is 1919 when John Miller patented the under friction wheel system for roller coasters. You had started to see roller coasters evolve away from those mild-mannered thrillers into, some deeper drops and higher speeds, but they were limited by what they could do because there was always that danger of the train coming off the tracks. John Miller developed a way to lock the wheels onto the tracks, making that impossible, and it's still the system that is used today over 100 years later. So, I mean, that transformed, the roller coaster from a mild-mannered scenic attraction into a thrill ride and kind of the king of the park. So, those are two, great moments. I mean, the development of kiddie rides in the 20s. It had always been a very adult-focused industry, but, William Mangles started developing scaled-down versions of kiddie rides, and that actually gave rise to kiddie parks starting in the 20s, which really took off in the 50s. And I think one of the things that's kind of related to that I've always found interesting is there are very few true firsts in the industry. What you typically I've discovered is it's an evolutionary process that then is catalyzed by a single event. If you look at the history of the roller coaster, LaMarcus Thompson did not invent the roller coaster. There were already roller coaster rides there, but his ride captured the attention of the world, probably because it was at Coney Island, and really turned the roller coaster into its own type of ride. Walt Disney did not invent the theme park. Knott's Berry Farm, they built their ghost town in 1940. 1946, Lewis Cook built Santa Claus Land in Indiana, which was kind of really the first amusement park built specifically with a storyline behind it. Charlie Wood in 1954 built Storytown, which is now the Great Escape. So there was already this evolutionary process going on where people were creating these environments within the context of a bigger amusement park that then Walt Disney really catalyzed. And so, when Disneyland opened, it really kind of changed the equation. I mean, I think you could even do things even today, like, the opening of, Harry Potter at Universal in 2010. There was already movement towards those immersive environments, but then the attention it generated really kind of shifted the conversation.
So, Jim, within that answer, it sounded like you busted a few myths already. People think that, maybe that, Disney invented the theme park and there were a lot of other things before that. One of the things I'm curious about is earlier you mentioned your book about Pennsylvania parks. Mm-hmm. And there's still so many parks thriving in Pennsylvania. A lot of parks that from around the country, those similar kind of parks have fallen to the wayside or gone out of business. And I'm curious, what is it about Pennsylvania? Is there something in the water out there that is allowing all these parks to thrive?
Well, I think a lot of it has. Okay, I think there's a couple things that that are going on in Pennsylvania. I mean, you start out with the topography; it's very rolling, so you kind of end up with all these little pockets in the state, little towns that are built around a specific economy. So, Eastern Pennsylvania, you had a lot of small towns that were built as coal mining towns, coal mining communities, farming communities. And because of the topography, it was kind of difficult for them to link together. And so I think, what you saw was a lot of really small amusement parks that popped up in the late 1800s, early 1900s. A lot of trolley line development here. So, I mean, it was really, I think, kind of the hub of trolley park development here, which is why it's still has more trolley parks still operating here than any other place in the country. And, you had literally hundreds of amusement parks in operation here just because of that. And, as the economy changed and, road systems became better, then you started seeing that migration to the bigger, better run parks. So you had a period in the 1980s where literally half the amusement parks in Pennsylvania closed. That was tied to a lot of them were aging facilities. The economy was changing. A lot of them were losing their industrial picnics. And I think you found that was when you started seeing, I think, a lot of the ones that had that really strong management who had that vision. make those investments where they were going to survive. So, you saw, I mean, I think the best example is Knoebels. If you look at Knoebels back in the 50s, there were dozens of parks in that region just like Knoebels. Why did they survive? So I mean, so I think that showed their I think the vision of Dick Knoebel to move the Phoenix, that kind of cemented them as the park that was going to survive in that part of Pennsylvania with that kind of investment. You look, Paul Nelson in Erie at Waldameer. I mean, he had that same vision. I mean, he was famously known for saying, "I'm going to spend so much money that you can't shut this park down." And at the same time, 1986, he built the water park. He was one of the first amusement parks to combine a amusement park and a water park in one gate. So he made, again, he made that big investment to ensure the park's future. Kennywood, really, at a time when so many of those older family-owned parks, again, were making those big investments, putting in the Log Jammer, their first $1 million ride in 1975, becoming really, the only one of the few family operations with multiple gates. So, they bought Idlewild, they built Sandcastle, then expanded into New England. So it was, and I think it was interesting, up until the turn of the century, the only parks in the state that were not family owned and operated were Hershey Park and Sesame Place. So I think it was a process where you had these families who were used to competing with other parks because there was such a density, and they were able to make the right investments at the right time to ensure that they were going to be the ones that survived.
Wow. Jim, we're going to need to ask you the same question for all 49 other states. That is so interesting. Do you have about 5-6 hours or so?
Well, I mean, I've written similar books for New York, New Jersey, and Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. Beyond that, it might take a little while.
Jim, if you could go back to any time and place, where and when would you go?
Oh, there are two that, probably turn of the century, Coney Island during the first decade of the 20th century, because that was the center of the amusement park universe. And you really had, for the time, that's, was where the technology was being developed. That was, you had 3 big amusement parks in operation at the same time, along with dozens of independent operators. So it was really the center of the amusement park universe. And it would be fascinating just to be able to experience that environment firsthand. The 20s would be fascinating because just, the amount of, amusement parks that were around the country, the technology they were developing at the time. Even after, World War II, like the early years of theme park development, you have the theme parks, the kiddie parks, the smaller themed attractions, just to see that. But I think if I could only pick one, it would be that, first decade of the 20th century at Coney Island.
Jim, there's a question that we like to ask folks that work at, places that have a good bit of history, like a Kennywood and that type of thing. And it's about preserving the history, but also moving into the future. So I'm curious, from a historian's standpoint, like, what is your view on maintaining the history and the glory of the kind of the olden days of the park experience, but also, creating new experiences for guests?
Well, I think one of the things amusement parks are very good at is capturing the power of nostalgia. I mean, amusement parks are one of the few places where you can go and share a memory across generations, and a happy memory across generations. The one thing I'm looking forward to is my first grandchild is going to be born sometime later this year, and when I take them to Kings Island, he or she will be the 6th generation of my family to ride that merry-go-round. I took my kids on it. I went on it with my parents. My mom went on it with her parents and grandparents. So there are not many places in the country or in the world where you can have that experience, to share that same experience with your grandchild that you shared with your grandparents. So I think that's something I think the industry should always remember, that power of that shared experience. But then there are always new generations who want new things. So it is a balancing act. I think, having those core group of nostalgic attractions, benefits a business, but you can't lose sight of, here's what the new generation wants, and we have to remain relevant to them. You can't be a museum.
Mm-hmm. So Jim, at the most recent IAAPA Expo in 2024, there was, I would say, an exhibit on the trade show floor in the aisle recognizing all previous Hall of Fame winners. And it was something that definitely slowed me down in a week where I am otherwise moving extremely fast. And from what I understand, you were involved with that. And I'm wondering if you can just share, how that tribute came together.
Yeah, that was wonderful, wasn't it? I served for 18 years on IAAPA's Hall of Fame committee. And I think that was something that the committee always wrestled with, is how do we recognize these people on an ongoing basis? And early last year, Jakob Voll, CEO of IAAPA, gave the IAAPA team the directive, we need to figure out a way to better recognize all of the Hall of Fame members. And I think they've done a good job recognizing the incoming ones, but the Hall of Fame has been around since 1990 now. People who are in the industry now don't really have a lot of awareness. So, as IAAPA historian, I was asked to write the summaries of all 130 something inductees. And then I assisted the IAAPA team in coming up with the images that we needed. It was really, and I think the timing was good in that, they kind of changed how they recognize the Hall of Famers this year with the launch of the Legends event as a fundraiser for the IAAPA Foundation. So, kind of paying a lot more attention, making a much bigger event around the induction of these people. And I loved, how, they put them on one of the main aisles, just one person after another. I really think it made a powerful statement about these people who have made the industry what it is. And I know so much of what IAAPA is doing now is trying to develop that next generation of leadership, of industry leaders. And I think that made a very powerful statement saying that, here are the people that got us to where we are. Here's what you can learn from them. So, I'm glad they have made that commitment. And, I think, you do got to give, the IAAPA leadership a lot of credit for making that commitment.
Yeah. So, Jim, obviously we've been talking a lot about history, but certainly as you look at history, you start to see where the industry is going. So I'm curious your thoughts on kind of the future of the industry. I know earlier you mentioned nostalgia and, having those experiences shared, but, people are talking about technology and VR and all these different things. So kind of where do you see things going?
I think you again look to the past to see how remarkably adaptive that this industry has been. And where I'm seeing now, you will always see this need for thrills and escape. You'll see development there. But the interesting trend I'm seeing is just how this blurring of just what is an amusement park now. I mean, they're putting rides on cruise ships. You're seeing, I think you see, as ways to take that, fundamental human need to be entertained and escape, people coming up with new ways to do that. I mean, you look at a place like Anarchista in Pigeon Forge, which, what is it? I mean, it's kind of an amusement park. They have some ride type attractions, but, it's zip lines and natural attractions. It's up in the woods. So, the adventure parks and, farms, how, going and getting your fall pumpkin has always been a tradition, but now they're putting in amusement parks that only run in September and October. And then you're seeing, that even going another step further where, a place like Bankson's Pumpkin Farm in Illinois, they're putting in some really high quality attractions and kind of growing their season beyond those 2 months in fall. So I think you will continue to see this blurring of just what is an amusement park, and which for me kind of makes my job a little more complicated, because now what do I got to start keeping track of? But it's going to be interesting to see what role technology plays. Again, you can learn from the past. I remember in 1984 when Star Tours opened, and a lot of observers were saying that's the end of roller coasters, because why do you need to build a roller coaster when you can just change the program in a simulator? 4 years later, Shockwave opened at Six Flags Great America, started the roller coaster arms race of the 90s. So, there will be a role for technology. I don't think technology will completely supplant those basic thrills and entertainments. I think it might enhance them in some instances, but I think there will always be roller coasters. There will always be merry-go-rounds. There will always be miniature trains. There will always be dark rides. The form they take will always change and evolve, but that basic thrill will not.
That is so fascinating. So Jim, as we start to wind this down, and I feel like our time has been flying by here, I've got two questions for you, the kind of rapid fire questions here, if that's okay.
Okay.
The first one is, we talked a little bit about, before we started recording, you both, Jim and Matt, both pointed out your Kennywood signs that you have in your office. You also talked about the press kit from Marriott's Great America from the opening. What's the most unique or significant piece of memorabilia you have?
Wow. That's a tough one. I mean, yes, I have so much. I mean, my collection of postcards is such a valuable tool for me. I think one of the things, I was probably one of the last people in the world to shoot color slides. I photographed every amusement park I went to with color slides from 1980 to 2013. In that closet back there, I have 38,000 slides of amusement parks from around the world. And there's some great images in there. I mean, some weird one-off things, like I have a brake shoe from the Scenic Railway, Pleasure Beach, Great Yarmouth in England. It's this big, heavy piece of iron. But it's just such a cool thing to have, and a great memory of such a unique ride.
Nice. All right. Second one. I live a couple miles from the former site of Riverview Park in Chicago. Is there anything there to see left from the park?
There is a small part of the Midway. If you go into the woods, I'm trying to remember. I mean, you have the river walk, and then there's some woods behind it. You can see some. You can see like some flat concrete there. That was part of the Riverview Midway. You see skateboarders and BMX riders using it a lot now. There's like mounds that have been built. So yeah, that I believe is the last part of Riverview still there.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
So Jim, this has been a fascinating conversation, and like Josh, I started in the industry as a ride operator, actually at Canopy Lake Park up in New Hampshire. I know they have an amazing history, and I would love to pick your brain sometime a little bit more about that. But just to be respectful of your time today, if people wanted to know more about you, or maybe even some books or things to look up their own version of the history, where would you send them?
Well, there's a lot of good books that are out there. Really, the most recent comprehensive overview of the industry is the Amusement Park 900 Years of Thrills and Spills, and the Dreamers and Schemers Who Built Them by Steven Silverman. That's been out about 5 or 6 years now. One that I always come back to, even though it's a bit older of a book, is The American Amusement Park Industry by Judith Adams. Gary Curiosi's penultimate work, The Great American Amusement Park, is still one of my favorites. There's a publisher in Ohio, River Shore Press, that has produced some really good books. One of which, Imagineering an American Dreamscape, talks about the development of the theme park industry. that's a very good read. IAAPA's website, we have about 50 edited oral history interviews up there. So there's, you can go and listen to people like Richard Sherman and Marty Sklar and Bob Gurr, so some real legends in the industry. Then if you want to do your own research, the greatest gift ever given to historians was newspapers.com. It's like a $10 a month subscription. You can do unlimited searches and downloading of articles. Billboard magazine is on Google Books beginning in 1942. So those are a couple of great sources if you just have a question about an amusement park that you want to see what you can find out.
Well, we've definitely got our work cut out for us then. So we appreciate that list right there. And what about you as well? If people wanted to get a hold of you directly, where would you send them?
Probably reach out on LinkedIn. It's probably the best thing. Or I'm on Facebook too. So that's the best place to start.
Excellent. Well, Jim, this has been a wonderful conversation, a great trip down memory lane, and getting a glimpse of what the industry has in store in the years to come. So thank you so much for your time and your energy today. And for everybody out there who's watching and listening, just remember, we are all attraction pros.